Hi, everybody, and welcome to week one, the speech chain. This week, we are going to have just a brief lecture, an introduction to some of the basics about communication so that we can sort of set the stage for what's coming in the next few weeks. The speech chain is a process. It's 6 steps in which we discuss how spoken communication goes from the mind of the person who creates a thought, and that message travels through the process of creating language, then into creating speech, how the articulators move together to create a message, using airflow and create sound waves, and those sound waves are transmitted to the listener. The listener's ear interprets the message, and that listener's ear hearing mechanism translates the message into a signal that they give meaning to. Well, that seems rather simple, right? But it's actually quite complicated, and let's just break it down into the individual steps and talk about some of the problems that can happen along the way. So in this chart, you can see, it's a little hard to see with the font being so small here, but this talks quite a bit about the different stages along the way in which the speaker and listeners' systems of communication have to be aligned and to communicate clearly. The speech chain starts in the speaker's brain. The first step of the speech chain is always the speaker's brain. And this is where the person who's originating the idea has to sort through their ideas, their thoughts, and they have to make a decision as to how they want to express their idea, and then they have to begin the process of creating a message. So what potential problems might occur if there is a breakdown in the speaker's very first step in the speech chain? Well, there could be a cognitive deficit, an intellectual deficit, a deficit of intelligence or ability to think or use higher order thinking skills, or there could be a speech language impairment. Having an impairment in cognition can significantly impact the ability to think clearly, to create a clear and accurate thought, and begin the process. So step 2, once the message or the idea has been decided upon, it is then continued in the speaker's brain, where the speaker then puts the message into language form. They have to choose the words, the word order, the morphology, in other words, the grammar that they want to use to express this message forward. Are they going to make it a declarative? Are they asking a question? Are they making a statement? So all of these decisions are made at the level of the speaker's brain. Once the message is formed into language, the motor strip in the brain has to then decide how to formulate the sounds that make up the message and send the neural impulses from the motor strip in the brain to the actual speech mechanism, which involves the vocal folds, the diaphragm, the exhalation of air, the articulators of the mouth, the lips, the tongue, the teeth, the velopharyngeal port, that piece that closes off the oral cavity from the nasal cavity. All of these have to work in very rapid succession in order to make the sounds that make up the message that has been translated into language. So what could go wrong here at this level? Well, quite a bit of things can go wrong here. Certainly the impact of that continued cognitive impairment will or could potentially impede the creation of a correct language form. So a speech language impairment, cognitive impairment, the lack of mastery of language itself. So young children might have a different ability to form a language message than a person who has a more mature knowledge of the language system. Just general knowledge of semantics, word choice, vocabulary, experiences. So general knowledge base can have a limiting effect on the actual content of the message. So these limits or these problems make it difficult to formulate the thought, not knowing the correct word to choose, not knowing the grammar to put together. All of these can make challenges for individuals who may have deficits in any one of these areas. Step 3 potential problems could involve oral motor deficits, anything that's going to impede the progress or ability of the motor strip to formulate or to send the neural impulses to the oral mechanism to create sound. So it can be disabilities such as cerebral palsy, apraxia, dysarthria. It might be a motor planning deficit of some other kind, simple articulation or phonological process errors, articulation being the inability to perhaps make a sound how it's intended to be made, or a phonological process error, the imposition of a rule onto the production of a sound that may or may not be shared by the general populace, or may be a factor of the immature oral motor system. So a young child's ability to say a very complicated long word is different than that of a grown adult. So how the message is actually formed by people who have motor planning deficits or some other type of delay or difficulty in producing correct articulation might have difficulty at step 3. And so I posed some questions here, and think about it. Have you ever tried to say a tongue twister? Why is that hard? Sally sells seashells by the seashore. Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. The faster you go, why does it become hard? What about the impact on your articulation accuracy when you're tired or medicated or sleep deprived? What about after you visit a dentist and perhaps you've had some Novocaine? How does that paralysis, even though temporary, how does that impact your ability to formulate a clear message? So step 4 and 5 of the speech chain are involving what happens after it leaves the speaker. So the sounds that are created by the oral mechanism in the speaker's mouth create sound waves. Those sound waves travel through space and time from the speaker to the listener. Once they arrive at the listener's hearing mechanism, we are relying on the fact that the hearing mechanism of the listener is intact and ready to receive the message. And the sound waves are processed by the hearing mechanism of the listener, which is, again, quite an extensive process, which we'll get into on another week. But what are the potential problems that could happen at steps 4 and 5? Well, certainly residual effects of the motor planning problems from step 3 and 4 can create incorrect sounds. So let's say the word was sit, and the motor planning or articulatory errors created the word fit or dit. Then that sound wave is significantly different than the intended message. The sound wave that is created arrives at the listener's ear and creates an incorrect message that has to then be interpreted by the listener. Noisy environments can also impact the effectiveness of the sound wave. At step 5, when the message arrives at the listener's ear, hearing loss, location, proximity of the speaker to the listener, the adequacy of the outer, middle, and inner ear of the listener also can impact the effectiveness of the listening mechanism and therefore the interpretation of the message. The end of the chain, or step 6, happens in the listener's brain. So after the hearing mechanism processes the information that was sent from the speaker's mouth through sound waves into the listener's ear, is then transformed into a neural signal. That neural signal goes to the listener's brain. At the listener's brain, they have to process the information that was received, interpret it, and then impose meaning on it. Was it sarcastic? Was it a question? Was it figurative language? Was it a declarative? Are they being asked to do something? Do they need to respond? All of these issues need to be dealt with at the listener's level. Now, if you think about the simple message of wait, stop, come back, how quickly that might be said, and it goes from the speaker to the listener, having gone through all of those steps in milliseconds. So while the speech chain in and of itself seems quite simple, it's actually quite a complicated process. So potential issues that could happen at step 6. Well, certainly, again, now language, context, dialect, knowledge-based differences between the speaker and the listener can impact the quality and the effectiveness of the message. Cognitive and language impairments, auditory processing impairments that are on the behalf of the listener can also impede the effectiveness of the message. Realize too that now the listener, even if all of those things are intact, they will impose their own beliefs, their knowledge, their understanding, their context onto the message they have received before it is responded to. So just think, for example, have you ever said something and been misunderstood? You know, obviously we all had that experience, and this might explain how those misinterpretations can happen so easily. Well, you think, okay, that's the step 6, the 6 steps of the speech chain, but it doesn't actually end there. You have to also think about the impacts of auditory information and visual information. The speech chain doesn't happen in a blindfolded circumstance. You can watch a speaker's mouth. You know what their lips are, what lip movements they're using. You can watch their facial expression, their body gesture. All of those pieces of what communication is express a part of the message and aid in the understanding. So as you think along this about the speech chain and all of the impacts it has, whether it's working or not working, and issues that can come along the way, take a look at these reflection questions and think about your own experiences with the speech chain and how communication as a whole is impacted by any small disruption to the process. That's all for tonight, and have a great evening.